Today I want to talk about WordPress, and more specifically I want to talk about using WordPress as a backend. What I mean by using WordPress as a backend is using it for its administrative features and as a data storage platform, and not so much for theming or the front-end features that it gives you. So, as you might have noticed in the description, I'll kind of take a focus on using it in the context of building really JavaScript-heavy single-page applications, but there are a lot of other use cases where it'll be handy to use WordPress as a backend. So really what I want to demonstrate is the value of being able to extract data out of WordPress and use it in other development projects and development environments. And this is all now suddenly relevant because it's expected that later this year, the WordPress JSON API, which is now being developed as a plugin, will be introduced into the core software, and that will make it really easy to extract data out of WordPress. Before we begin, just a little bit about myself. I'm a JavaScript engineer at Automatic. I work on a small team there, primarily responsible for maintaining and developing the WordPress.com REST API. As a JavaScript engineer, I also had a hand in helping to build the next generation WordPress.com platform, which itself is a single-page application built on top of our own REST API. I also co-host the Cincinnati WordPress Meetup Group. We meet every third Tuesday of the month. If you're in the area, we'd love to have you join us. If you're not in the area, I really recommend reaching out and getting involved in your local meetup group. It's been great for me, even just learning and networking and meeting new people and seeing different perspectives on building and using WordPress sites. Previously, I worked at a local agency in Cincinnati. That's where I got my start using WordPress. So I've built dozens of WordPress sites in the traditional manner, building themes. And so what I'm going to show you today is kind of a different approach in building websites using WordPress. And so I wanted to give a little bit of a distinction between websites as we've known to build them traditionally with WordPress and then web applications, because what we're describing here is a different strategy in building websites. And so when I think of websites or a traditional WordPress site, I think of them as a set of interconnected documents, and really they're content heavy. They follow a very similar pattern here. And this works great if what you're doing is you're building a very content-driven site. But it's not very rich, and you'll see here, I've got a little animation. You know, you click on a page, there's this flicker as it re-renders this entire page. So it's you go from one page to another throughout the site. It's not this seamless experience. Whereas a web application is more like a desktop app in that it's very interactive. You can click on things and things happen immediately. So what I have here is Slack, which is a popular chat software which the core WordPress itself uses. You can see I can click on that button down there and it opens these context menus, preferences. I can click around, things change. I can search and things are loaded in the background. And as soon as I click buttons, things change immediately on the page. It's a much richer experience. And so what I'm really getting at is that speed matters, and I would make the claim that built properly, a JavaScript single-page application would be much, it would feel much more responsive and more immediate to a user's actions than a traditional website would feel. And part of the reason behind this is with JavaScript, you have complete control over the page at any point in time. So even when you need to make these network requests in the background, you need to load data in, you can update the page in such a way that you give the user this impression that things are actually happening. And so you traditionally see this as like a spinner. Spinner doesn't really provide much context. It doesn't need to be a spinner. I like to point to the Facebook example on their mobile app, which is not a web app, but the same principle applies. And it doesn't show up very well here. When you first load the Facebook app, it shows these little pulsing fake stories. But it gives some context, and it gives this perception that something's happening. And it's a much more seamless transition when that data actually loads in. There's also this concept of optimistic rendering. So say, for example, you have a form, and you need to submit that form. Well, you do need to make a network request, to actually persist the field values from that form. And that network request may fail, may succeed. More often than not, assuming that you validate on the front end, it's going to succeed. So with JavaScript, you could just assume that it's going to work properly, and then maybe take the user back to a list or whatever you wanted to display that will show that data. And because you have access to that data, you can treat it just as if there were any other data that you would need, that you would retrieve from WordPress itself. So I want to touch on a little bit of terminology here, because quite a few acronyms involved in explaining the JSON REST API. So I'm going to go through each of these one by one. JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it is a text format that you can use to represent a certain piece of data. And because it's text, you can transmit it over a network request. And you can see that it's structured very similar to a JavaScript object, if you're familiar with what a JavaScript object looks like. It itself is not a JavaScript object, it's text. It's just text, but it follows this syntax. And one of the nice things about JSON is that it's very easy to convert back and forth, especially in the browser, but almost any programming environment, PHP included, makes it easy to take a piece of data, convert it to JSON, and then vice versa, take a piece of JSON text and convert it back into its data representation. So because it's so easy, it's become by far the most popular way to communicate using web APIs among the popular services. Next, REST. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. And really REST is just sort of a set of principles that describes how to build a web API. And chief among those, I like to highlight both stateless and resource-driven. And by stateless, I mean each request is completely independent from one another. So you don't have this concept of long-lived sessions or a login session. Any request that you make has all of the data in it that you would need to make that request. And it's resource-driven in that it's built around your data model in the backend. So in WordPress, you can imagine posts is the most obvious example of a resource in WordPress. So through a combination of HTTP verb and a very predictable endpoint pattern, you can take all of the actions that you would want to make on a particular resource through a web API. So by calling making a GET request to the post endpoint, you could retrieve a list of posts, for example. So it's very predictable. Some of the more non-standard HTTP verbs are put, patch, and delete. GET and post are pretty common when you're browsing the web. Lastly, API. API is kind of a simple concept. It's just a contract or an interface through which you can interact with the service. So in this case, what we're talking about is the WordPress JSON API gives you this interface that you can communicate with the underlying data in WordPress itself. So before I talk about where we're going with the WordPress JSON API, I want to talk about the history up until this point of how we've been able to get data out of WordPress. Because this is not a new idea. There have been ways before now that you can get data out of WordPress, but they just have not been enough, and that's why this new feature is being developed for the core software. So WordPress does have an API already, which uses the XML RPC standard. The problem with the XML RPC standard is it's verbose and it's extremely difficult to work with. You can see here, even just representing simple data structures, like an array with 2 strings. You can see over here the equivalent XML RPC serialization is much longer, which has a couple consequences. It increases the size of the response, so your responses might take more time to load. But then it's also just, you can look at the JSON string here, or the JSON here, and see that it actually, you can look at it and make sense of it. But if you look at the XML RPC, it takes a moment for your brain to figure out what's going on. And this is a simple example. You can imagine with an entire response, you couldn't just look at it without spending minutes trying to figure out what it's actually doing. It's also difficult to work with because, particularly when we're talking about single-page applications, it's not easy to work with XML in the browser. JSON is very easy to work with in the browser, so and that's why it's not been used very often to build single-page applications. Next, the one that I'm most familiar with is the WordPress.com Jetpack REST API. And something that I think a lot of people don't realize is that you don't have to have your site hosted on WordPress.com to use this. You can have a self-hosted site, assuming that you have Jetpack installed. By default, the REST API module is enabled, and so you can use a RESTful JSON API right now with your Jetpack site. So because it comes by default with Jetpack, it's very easy to set up. It's also secure and mature because a client interacts not with your site directly, it interacts with WordPress.com. WordPress.com runs HTTPS, so all of the connection between the client and the API is encrypted. It's mature, it's been around for years now. We use it ourselves, like I said, we are using it to build WordPress.com. So we are, this idea of dog fooding. We've learned what works and what doesn't. We've iterated on endpoints. We're several versions in for some of the endpoints. And chances are, if there's a feature that you'd expect to be available, it's already available. Some downsides that people might consider: if you don't want to have Jetpack installed, if you don't want to have a WordPress.com account, you're out of luck. And then just the nature of how it works. WordPress.com basically sits in the middle and acts as this sort of communication hub. So requests come in, and WordPress.com will translate it into an XML RPC request that's then sent to that site. So instead of being just a hop between a client and a site, it has to go through WordPress.com. I wanted to mention admin Ajax. Really, admin Ajax is just a step above a PHP file. It allows you to hook into or use WordPress functions, but there's nothing that's there by default. There's no endpoints that you can call to retrieve data, but you can create your own. All you have to do is create an action handler that uses an action that's prefixed with WP_Ajax. And you can call that from the browser, and then from that function, you can call WordPress functions, do something, write out content, and then kill the script, and that will be returned as a response. So finally, WordPress JSON API. This is intended to be an alternative and potentially maybe replacement for the existing XML RPC API. It's modeled after those RESTful principles that I explained earlier. It's built to be extendable, so plugins can create their own endpoints that are namespaced to prevent naming collisions. It's expected to be later this year. There's not a set version that they're saying that it's going to be available for. It'll be ready when it's ready, essentially. But it is available now as a plugin. So if you're not already familiar with how major features are introduced to WordPress, they're normally now built as plugins available through the plugin repository that you can download, and at a point at which it becomes stable enough, they'll be introduced into the core software. So this is official. It will be part of WordPress at some point in time in the future. So obviously, we're talking about using the data in WordPress. We're going to need to query that data out. So the WordPress JSON API includes several endpoints by default for all posts, pages, comments, users, etc. And it's very easy to query it using query parameters which are mirrored after those options available in WP Query. If you're familiar with WP Query, most of those options are still available here. I just want to highlight the URL here. So you'll see any request to the JSON API starts with WP-JSON. And I should have mentioned this earlier. Newer versions of the JSON API have this different idea of a namespace. So now what we can expect in the future is that these endpoints will be namespaced, and the core namespace is WordPress. So I should explain that the plugin that's available on the plugin repository for the JSON API is kind of out of date. They're actually doing a complete rewrite, and so what you see here might not be what, if you've looked at it before, might not be what you've seen before. So keep that in mind. It might not be wise to build anything serious on it because they've shown this willingness to make backwards and compatible changes until it'll be introduced into the software itself. So beyond querying data, you might want to create new endpoints. Either new endpoints where you can execute custom logic, or maybe you have a custom post type that you want to be able to retrieve out of WordPress. Well, the JSON API needs to be made aware of those endpoints. So to create a custom endpoint, you can use the register JSON route function, which expects 3 parameters. First is the namespace. Second is the actual route that you would be able to reach that at. And then the third is an array of arguments that sort of describes that endpoint. It describes what methods you can use to call that endpoint, readable, creatable, updatable, deletable, etc. And then you want to give it a callback, which is just the code that would actually be executed when you hit that endpoint. If you want to make a custom post type and make it available, just like the posts and pages and all that are available already, they've given 2 options here to show your custom post type in the JSON API, and then also to customize the endpoint base that custom post type is available at. By default, I think it defaults to the post type name, but most of the default ones use plural, so that's why I'm changing it here. There are a few authentication options available. If you are building something that's going to be hosted on the same site, they recommend that, or it's easiest to use cookie authentication. Cookie authentication comes with this concept of security nulls. So the WordPress JSON API is, you can interact with it from separate domains, which is awesome because if you're hosting a single page application, you can do these cross-domain requests. But that kind of opens up this concern about cross-site scripting attacks. So when you're using cookie authentication, you also need to use this security nonce, which is just a randomly generated string that makes sure that the request is actually coming from the page that the user is viewing. And on the next slide, I'll show that the JavaScript library that they bundle with this handles that for you in the background, so it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you have to concern yourself with. If you're building something that's not on the same domain, maybe it's on a separate domain, or it's a mobile application, you have other options here, OAuth and basic authentication. They recommend using OAuth only because with basic authentication, you're essentially sending credentials over the network every single request that you're making, which is not necessarily a problem if your site has SSL enabled, but most sites probably don't, so that's why they recommend using OAuth. Basic authentication is easy to use though, so if you're developing or you just want to make a curl request, you can use basic authentication to do that. And those are only for the authenticated endpoints. A lot of the data that you're querying is public anyways, so you don't need to concern yourself too much with that. It does include a JavaScript library. This is part of the official plugin right now, which essentially extends Backbone models and collections. Backbone is probably the only framework that's bundled with WordPress, and it's very minimal, simple to use, so I think that's probably why they chose to do it that way. But they make it easy to fetch a post, for example, fetch and query a set of posts. And then also talking about the nonces, they handle that for you in the background, so you don't have to concern yourself with it. So when would you want to use the JSON API? I've already talked about single-page web apps. Mobile apps. Really what I get across here is you gain platform independence now because you have data in WordPress that would traditionally, or up until now, was kind of difficult to get out of WordPress. And so you could have all these custom post types, and you can still have a WordPress site running as a WordPress site using the traditional template theming approach, but then maybe you go and you build a mobile app and you want access to that data. Right now it's kind of difficult, but once the JSON API comes out, it'll be very easy to get that data back out of the WordPress site. You could go smaller scale. You don't have to redo your entire site. You could add new widgets to your existing WordPress site. An example I thought of, maybe you have a real estate listing custom post type, And one of the pages on your site is just a map that lets the user pan around, and it automatically retrieves real estate listings in the background. Well, that'll be really easy to do when the JSON API is available. JavaScript themes. This is very much similar to single-page web apps. It's just an idea, and I've seen it done before. Basically, you'd build a site as a single-page app, but you'd bundle and distribute it like a theme. And the advantage is obviously is you build it as a single-page app, you get those speed benefits. You distribute it as a theme, users can install it really easily. How this would look, what you would essentially do is very early on in the WordPress page lifecycle. I don't think it's a init, it might be after a init. You would write out the HTML file for your single-page app and just quit, end the script immediately. You could also use it in other technology stacks. You could use whatever cool technology you want to use. You could build a Node.js app, which itself is interacting with WordPress behind the scenes on the server side to save and retrieve data. So I want to show you a demo that I've put together. What I'm going to show you is an example of building a custom, creating a custom post type that's been available through the JSON API, and then I've put together this little demo app, and I'll navigate around and show you how kind of nice it feels, and then we'll look a little bit at the code that makes that up. So first, I've built this as a plugin, but it's an extremely simple plugin. All it's doing is hooking in, going back to Bobby's talk, hooking into the init action here and registering a custom post type. Much the way that you would do normally, the only two additions that you might notice here are show in JSON and JSON base, which was the example that I gave earlier, so it's exactly the same. And then, so obviously at that point, I've created a custom post type. So on my dashboard here, I can see the cursor. There we go. I've got now a movies section, and I've already gone through and I've added all these movies with just a poster and a description. So that's all normal up until this point. Now, but because I said that it'll be available from the JSON API, you can see here now I'm at the route WP JSON WP movies. And what it does is it spits out all of the movies that I've stored here. I'm using a Chrome plugin. Normally it would look like that. I mean, that would be the data representation, but this is much easier to read. So what can we do with that then? So I put together this little demo app. Just, you'll see it's even hosted on a separate domain. And I refresh the page, and all of the data loads in. And you see, as soon as I click here, it immediately, you don't see that flicker as it needs to navigate between pages. This is a simple example, and this is kind of content driven, but you can imagine as this gets more complex, these interactions, and as immediate as they are very pleasing to a user. So let's look at code that makes this up. So this is index.html. The first thing I want to highlight is there is only one element really on this page. That's kind of what makes it a single page app, I guess. You could have header or something like that that's going to be on all your pages, but this idea is that everything that's rendered is rendered by JavaScript. And so the rest of the page here are a set of templates. And this is kind of a little trick that you can use to store templates on your page and still get the nice syntax highlighting. But you'll see that these are used on the JavaScript side to determine how the elements on the page are going to be rendered. And so this is, you'll see elements here that look kind of like what you would see in PHP, and really it's sort of the same idea. This is just done in JavaScript. Toward the bottom of the page, because this is completely isolated, stands alone, I have my app down here, but I need to bring in all my dependencies because the WP API library uses Backbone. Backbone depends on underscore jQuery and bringing all those in here. One thing I wanted to highlight is the WP API library expects settings. So on a normal WordPress site, this would be both the root and it would be a nonce that it would use then to submit those authenticated requests. In this case, what I want to do is say, this is my, this is a separate domain, WordPress.dev, that I'm telling it, here's where you retrieve that data out of. Here is now my app, essentially. This is all of JavaScript, also using Backbone. It's mostly straightforward. I've got a single model for movie, a collection of movies, some views, so like the app view, a list of movies, a list item, a detail view. Then I have my router, which says for these routes, show this content. And then I set everything up. So I'll go through each of these kind of briefly. My movie model, you'll see extends the WordPress API post model. And so this is what the JavaScript library gives you as these models. And Backbone makes it very easy to take that model and then extend it. So in this case, I want to extend it by saying, retrieve this, obviously not from the post route, but instead from the movies route. I've also changed it to not retrieve it by ID, but instead by the slug, because it's kind of nicer looking than in the URL than showing an ID. And then I need to do a couple things like fetching the featured image. The featured image doesn't come in the response. They might change that, but right now I have to go manually fetch that featured image separately. The movies collection is obviously simpler. Not really much to do here besides say, here's where you fetch all of the movies, and here's the model that represents an item in that collection. And then the app view doesn't do a whole lot. All the app view does is renders the header and renders the content area that then would be filled with the actual content. And there's two different types of content. There's the list view and the detail view. The list is an unordered list that iterates over this collection, creates a moving list item view, and then renders that into the app view. And so all of these are pulling from the template that I showed you on the front end, and they are taking the data that was retrieved from the REST API, injecting it into that view, and then rendering it onto the page. So this is just kind of a different way of building websites or web apps. And you don't have to use Backbone. You can use Converter, Angular, whatever your preference is. Like I said, there are two routes. The default route shows the list, and then you have a detail view that's at movie/slug. And I need to fetch the data. This is what fetching data looks like in using, well, Backbone. That's essentially just Backbone, but it's pretty easy to work with. So you can say, for example, here's a better example. I can say, I want to get this piece of media, fetch it, and when that's done, I want to set the property on this model to that piece of media, which is then used by the template to know how to render the element on the page. And then I just create an instance of that router, and I start up Backbone routing. And then I hijack all of the links on the page, because by default, a link would do what a website would do, which would be to re-render the entire page. But I want to stop that and instead tell it to do its routing through Backbone. Because you'll see here the detail route isn't sometimes you'll see these JavaScript heavy apps that do like hashbang, exclamation point, or something like that. There's this idea of push state. And so just like in WordPress, you point basically every route goes through index.php at the base of the WordPress installation. Same thing here. everything's just routed through your application, and Backbone figures out, okay, this route matches this pattern, and then I render the detail view onto the page.
Can you expand on that a little bit? So this is actually, because it's changing the URL, and the URL can interact with the web app. So could you, I mean, you could send somebody to this specific URL,
yeah.
and it would activate that part of the code to bring up the version.
Yeah, so you'll see that I can refresh this page and it loads fine. The way that's working, as I said, any request that comes into the site will go through index.html. Index.html loads the JavaScript application. The Backbone router started. There's 2 route patterns, one for the index route, one for a detail view. It says, oh, hey, look, that URL looks like a detail view. And here's how I handle that. How I handle that is right here, detail. I get the movie, and I fetch it if it doesn't exist, and then I create a movie detail view, and I render that, and then I tell the app to navigate to that view.
How do you change the URL and not trigger a new request in the browser like that?
Push state. So Backbone, the idea of push state is a standardized feature. You can say, I actually forget what the API is off the top of my head, but basically you say push state, here's the URL. I think you can give it some data too if that's what you want. And the idea of push state is you can pop state, so you get this fake history in the browser.
Yeah.
And so you can, when the user does back button, you can then react to the pop state as well. And that's wrapped here by Backbone. I say up here, my history, I want to opt to use this push state mechanism instead of the default hash way of doing it. It's kind of, it feels more like a website. Like, I don't know, it screams to me these JavaScript applications if you see that hashing. It doesn't need to be that way.
Does it, is it cross-browser compatible?
I think that's why up until this point it's not been as popular a thing as IE.
I think IE, if you change the URL, it refreshes by default unless you just use hashtags.
I do think the way that Backbone does it here, and probably the reason that this wrapper exists, is I think that it detects that support and then falls back. No, don't quote me on that, I might be wrong. But yes, there are older browsers, I think 8, maybe 9, that don't support push state, and that's why maybe some people have just opted to do it the way that works for every browser. But now that we've got standardized browsers, hopefully we're not working on IE much more. I get to work on IE 10 plus, so I'm a very happy person most of the time. But yeah, and so, this last bit here also ties into that. I say, instead of, whenever I click on a link on the page, stop what you would normally do. And instead of letting it navigate normally, tell Backbone to navigate. And Backbone will then look at the routing pattern and see, what do I need to do right now? Cool. Yep. And so, yeah, that's all I had. I just I wanted to show you a quick demo of what you can do with the JSON API. Yeah, thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, go ahead.
In terms of a visual representation, I've seen something that uses the API. Is that the new dash, the new post editor on WordPress.com? Is that all powered by the REST API?
So my team actually is responsible as well for building that editor that you're talking about. That editor is mostly built on top of the WordPress.com REST API. Parts of it still do PHP under the hood, but we are transitioning now to the new pages that we're building are completely single-page application. In fact, there's no PHP in the environment at all. So we're interacting entirely with the REST API at that point.
I'm glad you said that speed matters, because as I've used it, I've switched around in the post editor. Sometimes I see that beep, bop, boop, whatever the hell it is. And if everything was switching to that and it's not instantaneous like how you were showing, it's taking too long.
Yeah, no, and if you navigate around other pages on the site, you'll see that we're now mimicking the way that Facebook does it. And specifically, I've worked on the sharing page now that's on WordPress.com. And you'll see as soon as you click on that page, it immediately shows these like fake silhouettes is what I call them, these placeholder items. So you know that something's happening. And as data, this is the important bit, as data becomes available, I react to that. So talking about the post editor, we load everything up front, but a better way and the way that we may transition to in the future is as data comes in, we'll make elements on the page become enabled. And at least something will be on the page at any point in time. So you don't get that jarring experience of like, here's just a loader, and then all of a sudden everything's there. And that is how it is right now. And obviously, what I'm talking about here are ideals. I think talking about single page applications, why is not everybody building a single page application? Because I think up until now, it's taken a lot more effort. It's sort of a new, this era of JavaScript. Like, I'm a JavaScript engineer, that's a new title. It's because it's been difficult and browser support's been lacking, and there haven't been these frameworks like Backbone, Angular, Ember, React that make this so much easier now. So I think we're finally getting to a point where it's not as difficult as it once was to work with JavaScript, and now that we're going to have access to the data from WordPress, like, I don't know, it's a perfect match in my mind.
Is there any limitations to doing it with JavaScript? Like in terms of like, you're relying on the browser's memory available to it and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, performance is a concern. And really that depends on how well you build your application. I mean, if you're building your application poorly and you're just storing everything that you retrieve into memory, well, obviously that's going to lead to memory issues, but assuming that you discard the data that you're not using, the JavaScript garbage collector will come in the background and clean it. But I mean, even big, like Gmail, will have memory leaks from time to time. So these Google engineers that you would think could not have any flaws are running into memory leaks themselves. So it is a concern and it's especially a concern because these pages, people will have these pages open for long periods of time. Gmail especially, I have my Gmail tab open for weeks at a time. And so if there's a memory leak, it's going to crop up as a problem at some point. So that is something that you want to look out for. Sure.
What about cacheability? It's like my basic understanding is like with PHP, that's where you're on the server, and then the server can just cache that. Next time somebody requests a page, it just serves the cache copy. Whereas for JavaScript, it renders in the user's browser, and so it tends to be a bit more intensive on the system resources. So, can you kind of talk about like the cacheability and scaling with the app?
Yeah. I mean, there are varieties of strategies that you could use there. We try to strategically use like local storage in a browser. So the first time you go to a page and it needs to load all the sites, well, chances are you're going to need that data on lots of pages. So instead of like next time around you come to a page and you can make a network request, we'll save it into local storage, which is a feature of the browsers that just I can retrieve it out and it's there immediate to me. Talking about more on the server side, I think that's kind of an area for plugins to kind of come in. Maybe the existing caching plugins will start to accommodate the JSON API. What I would love to see is those caching plugins to basically generate static files that are served out of the API. That when you make changes to posts, it's basically just generating a static file. And in that case, you're going to have just raw, awesome performance that probably better than any other application setup that you'd have. And it's easy to do in WordPress because you can hook into, like, after a post is saved, well, blow away what I have and generate something new. And it's just a static file. So, that might be an approach to take as well.
So I have a question. And this is probably the first time I've had to ask this question, so it might not make any sense. So I'll warn everyone now that I'm thinking through. So in WordPress, right, like we spent 10 years building rewrite rules and object caches and building this whole environment for WordPress specifically, right? Kind of got it to a place where it's working, and templates working, and output is working, and plugins and themes are building a very reliable stack, right? And the JSON API is like a brand new generation of this. It's you have routers and Backbone. We're not using WordPress as permalinks anymore. We're using Backbone routers. So you bypass all that completely. sort of a convergence of like modern JavaScript front-end development with what we're used to for a reliable WordPress stack. So since we're sort of in the infancy of this relationship coming together, RESTful endpoints and rewriting plugins to have endpoints and using this API, if it's like a 10-year cycle, right, we're at the beginning of 10 years where we're all going to migrate all of our code to work with JSON endpoints and have single-page apps. What happens next, right? Like we spend the next 10 years re-implementing all this existing PHP code to be JSON RESTful, single-page apps and new template engines. Is that what the next 10 years is supposed to be?
I don't think that this is necessarily a natural progression, that we're just going to abandon everything that we know and build all of our sites this way. I mean, I would say that I love building single-page applications. I understand that there are kind of complications to doing that, and that for most cases, like if you're running a blog or a simple content site, building a single-page application is probably overkill. If you have the resources and money to do it, go for it. It's just a different way to build sites. Talking about WordPress and how it's kind of been built in such a way that's not in line with what we're talking about here, it is kind of a concern. And, you know, for example, look at if I'm building a single-page app, what happens when I edit a page and then I click View Page? Where does that go? I mean, if it's supposed to go to this single-page application, how does it know about that? So, you know, I think those are kind of, like you said, we're in our infancy, we're growing pains, and you know, maybe we find a good pattern. Like, I don't know, you update that link to point to the right place instead. And I thought about it too in the sense of like plugins. We've got all these plugins right now. Well, I will say right now, plugins rely on actions and hooks and things like that. So I mean, there will be some processing that goes on from the JSON API endpoints that use those actions and hooks, but you don't have a NIT. Well, you probably have a NIT, but you don't have all of the actions that you would expect from a regular page lifecycle. And these SEO plugins and things like that you're used to using on your site probably rely on those things. So it's just not going to like automatically work. But you know, the more I thought about it, I'm like, okay, well, the reason that WordPress works so well is just that it's flexible, and we've got this plugin ecosystem that you can build anything. What's to stop somebody from building a JSON API targeted plugin? I mean, it can work within the ecosystem as well. So I don't see it being as much a concern. I'm sure as time goes on, we'll need to make some changes to accommodate these different ways of building sites. So you know, I don't need all of this stuff to be loaded. You know, maybe those are just optimization improvements we make in the future.
Cool, thanks.
It seems like it'd be a perfect way to build a site from data and media from many different sources.
Yeah, I've heard, weren't you talking about an example of you have data in a WordPress site, and maybe you have many sites that all you need to use that same data. So to use WordPress as a backend is a perfect use case for that, because you can have this admin experience where all that data put in, all that data is put in, and then all of these different sites that then interact with that single source to extract data out of it. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but that's not how it's interpreted.
Yeah, many domains.
Yeah. Sure.
I use WooCommerce in my own products, and I also have been wanting to build an app that interacts with it. Now I can build my own custom JSON API to request to pull products down by category and use those in the app.
Yeah, and Woo, I'm not terribly familiar with it. I'm pretty sure Woo has their own API, or at least that they are, and I think that they have plans to integrate to use the JSON API. And I think that's what you would hopefully expect, is that these big plugins add their own endpoints. And so you don't have to go and create those endpoints yourselves. They probably, hopefully already exist. And it's obviously being built in such a way, because you'll see that those namespaces would be used by plugins to create their own set of endpoints that then you could use, like you said, in a mobile app. But you could, if you wanted to do something custom, create your own endpoint, which then does whatever you need in WordPress.
Do you know if there are any SEO implications behind doing a single page app like that for, you know, like a traditional website?
Yes. And I was well prepared for that question. It's a very common question because you saw, I showed you the source, there's one element on the page. So when you think of a search engine scraping a page, if they see a div, a single div on a page, what are they going to do with that? They can't see that. So a couple things to mention. First, Google has started to do, they'll actually execute JavaScript on the page. So they actually are now starting to be able to scrape JavaScript single page apps. The other thing is, this is easier. I'm familiar, I use React a lot, and I think you'll start seeing this in other frameworks where they make it easy to do server-side rendering. And what I mean by that is, not only is it being rendered on the client, but maybe part of your build process or part of the server-side request is to use that same code to then render it out to a string, and that's what's sent down to the browser. And so you look at the source of the page, it has all of my elements on there, and then when React detects it, it just kind of picks it up and like moves on from there. And it's great because you also saw when I showed you the list page, there's kind of a brief period where it's just blank. And you see that a lot with single page apps. I mean, you can use those strategies that I was talking about with placeholder content, but instead of that, you'd actually have content right on your page, which is fantastic. You don't even have to wait for the JavaScript to load. Assuming the styles are loaded and the markup's there, it's already loaded. You can also detect Google or any other search engine and maybe render something different. So instead of sending down your single page app, for every response, you could say, oh, this is Google request. Here, Google, here's what you should be scraping. And that's what they would scrape instead. And I think they actually have, this just came up, they have different ways that you can detect, I think it's through like a hashbang parameter that they will send, or they will send or detect. And so you can, from your single page app, detect that it's actually a Google client. No, this is the query parameter that I was talking about. And that's what I said with a request. You can see this is a Google request. Send this down instead. Great. All right, I think he came by a couple minutes ago, so there's 5 minutes left, so we're pretty much up.